Hello, Coach Holmes here, and today we're going to be talking about Isosceles Triangle. Now, Isosceles Triangle is pretty simple. Matter of fact, it's actually one of the type of triangles we talked about earlier. But we're going to dig a little bit more in depth with them. Isosceles Triangle, just to refresh y'all's memory, is a triangle with at least two congruent sides. Okay? Now, there's a lot of different things that we need to keep in mind when it comes about isosceles triangles. So, for example, these two sides are going to be congruent, these two angles are going to be congruent. Now, just to let y'all know, the vertex, give me a minute. So the vertex is going to be the point H, okay? Now, when we're talking about vertex, we're talking about the very point that is connected by two congruent sides, okay? That is the vertex of the isosceles triangle. It's just that point where the two congruent sides meet. Next, we have vertex angle, which in this case is just angle H. Okay, so there is a difference between the two. Vertex is the point, vertex angle is the angle. Next, we have the two legs. Now, typically, humans have two legs, so we're going to look at isosceles triangle as having two legs. So the two legs here is HI and HJ. These two sides, or the two congruent sides, are my legs. Okay? So those both of these are going to be my legs. So I know for sure that they're my legs because they're congruent sides. Now my base is the third length of the isosceles, but it's going to be the length that is not congruent. So IJ is the side that is not congruent, which is, I'm going to describe that as my base. Now, my base angle, there are two of them. I have angle I and angle J. So both of those angles are going to be my base angles. And more often than not, they're actually going to be congruent to each other. Speaking of which, we have base angle theorem, which tells us if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite the sides are congruent. So what does that mean? That means that if I have these two sides here that are congruent, this side opposites here is going to be congruent. Let me put it in blue. This side and this side are going to have opposite angles that are congruent to each other. So what does that mean? Well, if I'm trying to solve for x, I know that x is going to equal to 65. So this angle right here will be 65 degrees. Now, if I'm looking for y, well, let's remember, an interior triangle, the interior angle of a triangle is equal to 180. So if I have two sides that are 65, or two angles that are 65, we're going to add these up together to get 130. And then I'm going to subtract it from 130 to get 50. So y is going to give me 50 degrees. Okay? So that's important to know that the sides opposite of angle are going to be congruent, as long as both sides are congruent. Now, now the converse of it actually works as well, which means if two angles, I'm sorry, I'm rushing myself. If two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite them are congruent as well. So what does that mean? That means, and I forgot to add, well, yeah. Which basically means that if these two are congruent to each other, then the two sides are going to be congruent to each other as well. So, if I know these two are congruent, because I know these two sides are congruent, this is going to be 3x right here. Because I know that these two angles are congruent. So if I'm trying to figure out what x is, I'll add all these up and set it equal to 180. All three of these angles add up to 180. So 3 plus 3 is 6, plus 2 is 8x. 180 divided by 8. And that would give me 22.5. Okay? So that will be my value for x. Now, this is another interesting fact. It may not have to do with isosceles, but it's something that is always the case. A triangle is equilateral if and only if, so we have a biconditional statement here, if and only if the triangle is equal angular. Which means that not only are all three sides going to be equal, but all three angles are going to be equal. So let's check this out. So if I know that so notice how all three angles are congruent to each other. Well, we got to figure out what each angle is going to be. Well, since I know that all three are going to be equal, I'm just going to divide it by 3, which I know that gives me 60. So if I'm trying to solve for x, 2x equals 60. Divide that by 2. I get x equals 30. Okay? Now, but since all three angles are equal to each other, I know all three sides have to be equal to each other. So that means that 15 is going to equal to y minus 5. So if I add 5 to both sides here, y is going to be 20. So the value of y here is going to have to be 20. Now notice that all three angles are equal to each other because they're all 60. 60, 60, 60. And that will always be a case for triangles. If you have an equal angular triangle, all the angles are going to add up to, all the angles are going to be equal to 60. Okay? Because remember, we figured it out by dividing 180 by 3, and that gives me 60. So 3 equal angles out of 180 is 60 degrees. Now, since they're all equal to each other, all 3 sides are going to be equal to each other. So I know that x plus 10 is equal to 2x minus 8. And then I just got to solve for x. So if I add 8 to both sides, that gives me 18, x plus 18 equals 2x. Subtract x from both sides, 18 equals x. So I got x equals 18. Okay? So that's my value for x. Is actually going to give me 18. So what we got to remember is that the 2 sides of a triangle, opposite them are going to be congruent as long as the 2 sides are congruent. Two equal sides are called isosceles triangle. Equilateral triangle is also going to be equal angular as well. So if all 3 sides are equal, all 3 angles are equal, and vice versa. Okay? So we just got to remember the different qualities of an isosceles triangle. That we have the vertex angle, the 2 legs, the base, and the base angle. And just remember, the base angle are going to be congruent as long as both of the legs are congruent as well. Thank you, and have a good day.